They told you inflation was cooling. They told you the economy was resilient. They told you the labor market was strong and consumer spending was holding up and the worst was behind us. And I need you to hear me when I say this. They are lying to you. Not bending the truth. Not putting a positive spin on it. Lying. Because while they were telling you things were getting better, total household debt in this country quietly crossed $18.8 trillion. That is the highest number ever recorded in American history. It is 48% higher than the peak we hit right before the 2008 financial crisis that nearly collapsed the global economy. Credit card debt alone is sitting at $1.28 trillion, also the highest ever recorded, and Americans are paying an average of 22.8% interest on that debt, which means for every $1,000 you carry, you are handing the bank $228 a year just for the privilege of owing them money. The average car payment in this country just hit a record $742 a month. The average monthly mortgage payment is $2,205. Student loan serious delinquency just spiked from 0.7% to 16.2% in a single year after the payment pause ended. The National Foundation for Credit Counseling says their financial stress barometer is forecasting a historic high for the first quarter of 2026, and they used a word that should terrify you. Insolvent. They said a growing segment of Americans are not just overextended, they are technically insolvent, meaning they have income but zero remaining cash flow after covering basic necessities. 2/3 of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 27% have zero emergency savings, the highest ever recorded. 59% cannot cover a $1,000 emergency without going into debt. And while all of this is happening, America's billionaires added $1.5 trillion to their wealth last year, a 21.8% gain, while the rest of the country drowns. Let me hit you with something that I think fundamentally changes how you should be thinking about the American economy right now. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's quarterly report on household debt and credit, released February 10, 2026, total household debt in the United States stands at $18.776 trillion. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because most people hear trillion and their brain just glazes over. So let me put it in terms that actually mean something. The previous peak for American household debt was roughly $12.7 trillion, and that was in the third quarter of 2008, right before Lehman Brothers collapsed and the entire global financial system nearly went down. We are now 48% above that number. We have added the equivalent of Germany's entire GDP to American household balance sheets in just 6 years. And here is what makes this different from 2008 in a way that should genuinely concern you. In 2008, the crisis was concentrated in mortgages. Subprime lending had created a housing bubble, and when it popped, it took everything with it. Today, the debt is everywhere. Mortgages are at $13.17 trillion. Credit cards are at $1.28 trillion, the highest on record. Auto loans are at $1.67 trillion. Student loans are at $1.66 trillion. For the first time ever, non-mortgage consumer debt has crossed $5 trillion, and the delinquency rate on all of this is climbing. Bloomberg reported that overall delinquency rose to 4.8% of all outstanding household debt in Q4 2025, which is the highest level since 2017, and the New York Fed specifically noted that the deterioration is concentrated in lower-income areas and in areas with declining home prices. So the people who can least afford to fall behind are the ones falling behind the fastest. And the interest rates on this debt are brutal. Credit card APRs are averaging 22.8%. Auto loan rates for subprime borrowers are above 14%. The average new car loan is $43,582, and the average monthly payment is $742, which is a record. Think about that for a second. The average American car payment is $742 a month. That is more than a lot of people's mortgage payment was 10 years ago. And auto loan terms are stretching to absurd lengths, with the average new car loan lasting 69 months, nearly 6 years, and subprime borrowers locking in loans for over 75 months. You are paying off a depreciating asset for more than 6 years at double-digit interest rates. And the NFCC, which is the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, said something in their 2026 outlook that stopped me cold. They said that an increasing number of counseled consumers are technically insolvent, meaning they have income but no remaining disposable cash flow to fund a repayment plan after covering basic necessities. They have jobs, they are working, and they still cannot pay their bills. That is not a recession indicator. That is a structural failure. The paycheck-to-paycheck economy is not a phase, it is the system. I want you to think about something that I think most people have completely normalized and they should not have. 2/3 of American adults are living paycheck to paycheck right now. Let that land. Not a third, not half. 2 out of every 3 people you see at the grocery store, at your job, at your kid's school, they are one missed paycheck away from financial crisis. And this is not just a lower income problem. PYMNTS Intelligence, which has been tracking this in a massive ongoing study, found that between 60 and 70% of Americans have been living paycheck to paycheck consistently from early 2024 through early 2026, with no sustained improvement. And within that group, 20 to 25% report that they consistently struggle to pay their monthly bills. Not that things are tight, that they literally struggle to cover what they owe every single month. And when you break it down by generation, it gets even darker. 67% of Gen Z is living paycheck to paycheck. 63% of millennials, these are people in their 20s and 30s and early 40s who are supposed to be in their prime earning years and building wealth, and instead they are running on a treadmill that gets faster every month. Bankrate's 2026 Emergency Savings Report found that 27% of American adults have zero emergency savings. Not low savings, zero. Nothing. And 59% said they could not cover a $1,000 emergency expense without going into debt. The personal savings rate in this country has fallen to 4.5% as of January 2026, which is roughly half the 60-year historical average of 8.4%. Americans are saving at half the rate they used to and carrying record debt at the same time. And here is the part that really gets under my skin. Nearly 47% of Americans told Allianz Life that they are more financially stressed heading into 2026 than they were at the start of 2025. So things are not stabilizing, they are getting worse, and people can feel it even if the headlines are telling them otherwise. And meanwhile, an NFCC analysis found that approximately 20% of households in some states have zero or negative net worth. Negative, meaning they owe more than they own. And the wealth gap is staggering. The top 1% of Americans held 31.7% of all household wealth in Q3 2025, the widest concentration in 3 decades, while the median net worth of Americans under 35 is $39,040. That is a 10-to-1 ratio compared to households led by people aged 65 to 74. And I saw a story from CNN where a woman named Jones, who is a primary caregiver for 2 grandchildren, was recently diagnosed with cancer and wound up with $85,000 in medical debt and had to file for bankruptcy. She pushed back on politicians who claim there is no affordability crisis, and she said the people claiming prices are lower are not actually buying their own groceries or trying to find the cheapest place to get their car fixed. She said they need to walk in our shoes. And honestly, I think that one sentence captures the entire disconnect between what they are telling you and what is actually happening better than any data point I can give you, because the data says it is bad. But the lived experience of tens of millions of Americans says it is worse, and nobody in a position of power is being honest about the gap between those two things. Your health insurance just doubled, and millions just lost coverage. I need you to understand what just happened to healthcare in this country, because it happened on January 1st, 2026, and the media covered it for about 48 hours, and then moved on. The enhanced premium tax credits that had been keeping Affordable Care Act health insurance affordable for over 22 million Americans expired overnight. These subsidies were first introduced in 2021 as part of the American Rescue Plan to help people get through the pandemic. They were extended once, and then on December 31st, 2025, they were allowed to die, and the impact was immediate. According to KFF, which is the most respected nonpartisan health policy research organization in the country, premiums for subsidized ACA enrollees more than doubled on average, a 114% increase, from an average of $888 a year to $1,904 a year, and for a lot of people it is far worse than that. A 26-year-old woman named Terrell in Brooklyn, who makes $72,000 a year, saw her monthly premium jump by $700. $700 a month. She told CNBC the moment she saw the new number her stomach dropped. And she is not an outlier. KFF surveyed over 1,000 adults who were enrolled in ACA plans in 2025 and found that 9%, roughly 1 in 10, dropped their health insurance entirely because they could no longer afford it. Another 17% said they are not confident they can afford their premiums this year, which means they are at risk of dropping coverage too. That is more than a quarter of all ACA enrollees who either already lost coverage or are about to, and the people who kept their insurance are paying for it with pain. More than half, 55%, said they have cut or plan to cut spending on basic necessities like food and clothing to afford their health premiums. 43% said they are trying to find an extra job or work more hours. 23% are skipping or delaying paying other bills. 21% said they are taking out loans or increasing credit card debt to pay for health insurance. And the Congressional Budget Office projects that total ACA marketplace enrollment will collapse to 12.5 million by 2028, which would be about half of last year's enrollment and would erase nearly all the coverage gains made since 2021. The Urban Institute projected that 4.8 million Americans would drop coverage in 2026 alone. And a single mother named Provost told PBS that if Congress does not restore the subsidies, she will drop herself from the plan and keep insurance only for her 4-year-old daughter, because she simply cannot afford to cover both of them. This is where we are. A mother in America in 2026 is choosing between insuring herself and insuring her child. And the people who voted to let these subsidies expire did it to offset the cost of a tax cut. They traded your health care for a line item in a budget deal, and then they went home for recess. Housing has become a wall that an entire generation cannot climb. All right, I need to lay something out for you that I think is one of the most consequential economic shifts happening in America right now, and it has to do with homeownership. The median age of a first-time homebuyer in the United States has hit 40 years old. 40. That is a record. Your grandparents bought their first home in their early 20s. Your parents bought theirs in their late 20s. And now an entire generation is being told they might be able to buy their first house at 40 if they are lucky. And the math explains exactly why. The median home price nationally is sitting around $400,000. A 20% down payment on that is $80,000. The current mortgage rate is hovering around 6.5%. At that rate on a 30-year loan, your monthly payment on a $320,000 mortgage comes to roughly $2,000 in principal and interest alone, before you add property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, which pushes the real monthly cost north of $2,500 to $3,000 depending on where you live. And the Mortgage Bankers Association just reported that first-time homebuyers now account for only 27% of the market, down sharply from 34% in 2024. They are being squeezed out in real time. And the reason inventory is so low is something economists call the lock-in effect. More than 80% of American homeowners currently hold a mortgage rate below 6%. Many of them locked in rates at 3% or lower during the pandemic. And they will not sell because selling means giving up that rate and buying their next home at 6.5%, which could add $750 or more to their monthly payment on the exact same house. So they stay. And the homes that younger buyers need never come onto the market. Existing home sales have been stuck at roughly 4 million annually, which is the lowest level in decades. The National Association of Realtors calls it the most balanced market in a decade, but balanced is a polite word for frozen. And meanwhile, in markets like Los Angeles, the median home price is $860,000, requiring a household income of $160,000 just to qualify for a standard mortgage. In Austin and Miami, closed home sales are down 15 to 17% year over year. And here is what kills me. A Kinger analysis put it bluntly. For Gen Z adults and younger millennials, the housing market in 2026 is not slowly improving. It is a wall. And the distance between what a typical home costs and what a typical person earns has become so wide that modestly lower mortgage rates do not close the gap. Redfin says wages will grow faster than home prices for the first time since the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. But that progress is measured in years, not months. And in the meantime, the median first-time buyer needs $114,000 a year in income, according to Realtor.com, and the average American salary is $64,000. That is a $50,000 gap between what you need and what you have. And no amount of financial advice or budgeting tips closes a $50,000 gap. That is a systemic failure, not a personal one. And the cruelest irony is that 61% of baby boomers say they will never sell their homes. Not that they cannot, that they will not. They are sitting on the single most important wealth-building asset in American history, and they have no intention of making it available. The war you are paying for is about to destroy your grocery budget. I covered gas prices and trucking and farming in the last video I made, but I need to come back to this because the situation has gotten dramatically worse in the weeks since. Gas has now crossed $4.08 nationally, the highest since the summer of 2022. In California, it is $5.89. Diesel, which is the fuel that moves every single thing you buy across this country, is at $5.40 nationally and over $7 in California. And the war in Iran, which began in late February with the US and Israeli strikes, has completely shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of global oil and one-third of the world's fertilizer ingredients pass every single day. And the fertilizer impact is the part that most people are not tracking. Ammonia prices in the United States are 41% higher than they were a year ago. Urea, the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer in global agriculture, is up 21% and climbing. The American Farm Bureau Federation noted that countries in the Middle East exposed to the conflict account for roughly 49% of global urea exports and 30% of ammonia exports. Those are not minor disruptions. Those are core inputs to the global food system. And the timing could not be worse, because this is planting season. Farmers buy fertilizer and apply nutrients to their fields in the spring. If they cannot get it or cannot afford it, they either reduce application rates, which lowers yields, or they switch to less input-intensive crops, which reduces the total food supply. The FAO, which is the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, released their March data and world food prices rose 2.4% in a single month. Their chief economist Maximo Torero warned that if high energy and fertilizer prices persist beyond 40 days, many farmers will reduce inputs and the impact will hit food supply for the rest of this year and into next year. The United Nations projects global food prices could average 15 to 20% higher in the first half of 2026 if the crisis continues. The World Food Programme warned that 45 million additional people worldwide could be pushed into acute food insecurity as a direct result of this conflict. And grocery prices in America were already 24% above pre-pandemic levels before any of this started. Food-at-home inflation was running at 2.4% year-over-year in February. And the USDA's March outlook projects another 3.1% increase this year. And Deutsche Bank analysts said they expect the energy supply shock to produce a 25% increase in gasoline prices that will put upward pressure on inflation across the board. An economist at the University of Minnesota said the price of food is going to move quite a lot. He said higher fertilizer costs, higher fuel costs, and disrupted trade routes are all going to be passed through to the consumer. And a Cornell economist named Christopher Barrett said this is a problem specifically because of what preceded it. The tariffs already pushed up costs. The immigration crackdown raised labor costs. Data centers were already driving up electricity. And now, on top of all of that, you have an active war disrupting the supply chains that feed the world. And prices go up fast. They always do. But they come down slow. If they come down at all, the economy is walking into a trap, and the Fed cannot save it. The United States is walking into a policy trap. And by policy trap, I mean that the two institutions that are supposed to stabilize the economy when things go wrong, the Federal Reserve and the federal government, are both functionally paralyzed. Let me walk you through why. The Federal Reserve's job is simple in theory. When the economy slows down, they cut interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, which stimulates spending and hiring. When inflation gets too high, they raise rates to cool things down. That is the playbook. But right now, the Fed is facing a situation where the economy is slowing and inflation is rising at the same time. The economy lost 92,000 jobs in February. Unemployment has risen to 4.4%. Goldman Sachs has raised its 12-month recession probability to 30%. Moody's Analytics has their AI recession model at 49%, which is one single percentage point below the 50% threshold that has preceded every U.S. recession in the past 80 years. Consumer sentiment just crashed to 53.3 on the University of Michigan Index, which puts it in the bottom first percentile of the survey's 75-year history. And at the same time, inflation is re-accelerating. The PCE index, which is the Fed's preferred measure, came in at 2.8% year-over-year with core PCE at 3.1%. Goldman Sachs projects headline inflation could spike to 4.5% this spring if the Strait of Hormuz disruption continues. They have already pushed their expected timeline for rate cuts back to September and December. So the Fed cannot cut rates to help the economy because inflation is too high, and it cannot raise rates to fight inflation because the labor market is too fragile. That is the trap. And on the fiscal side, the federal government is equally stuck. The national debt just crossed $39 trillion. Interest payments on that debt are consuming over $1 trillion a year. The budget deficit is running at historically elevated levels. And the administration just passed a massive tax cut that reduces revenue at the exact moment when spending pressures are increasing. Goldman Sachs explicitly warned that fading fiscal support is removing a major layer of economic cushion at the exact time risks are rising. And what does that mean for you? It means that if the economy tips into recession, there is no cavalry coming. The Fed cannot slash rates like it did in 2008 or 2020 because inflation is in the way. The government cannot spend its way out because the debt is already at a level that makes new stimulus politically and economically dangerous. The traditional stabilizers are exhausted, and the consumer, who drives 70% of GDP, is being hit with $4 gas, $5 diesel, record credit card debt, doubled health insurance premiums, and a job market that is barely creating enough positions to keep up with population growth. That is not resilience. That is a system being held together by inertia and the fact that most people have not yet realized how exposed they actually are. AI is replacing workers faster than new jobs are being created. In March 2026, AI became the #1 cited reason for job cuts in the United States for the first time ever. According to Challenger Gray and Christmas, which has been tracking corporate layoff announcements for decades, 25% of all layoffs in March were explicitly attributed to artificial intelligence. That is up from 10% in February and 5% for all of 2025. In less than 3 months, AI went from a footnote in layoff reports to the single largest reason companies are firing people. And the specific companies doing this are not startups or fringe players. Block, which runs Cash App and Square, cut 40% of its entire workforce, over 4,000 people. The CEO Jack Dorsey wrote publicly that intelligence tools have changed what it means to build and run a company. He did not dress it up. He did not call it restructuring. He said AI made those workers unnecessary. Meta is planning to eliminate 20% of its workforce, roughly 15,000 positions, to fund its AI investments. Amazon already cut 30,000 corporate jobs across late 2025 and early 2026. Dell cut 11,000 in Q1 alone. Accenture eliminated 11,000 roles. And Citigroup is targeting 20,000 reductions, explicitly saying that AI-enabled systems are making middle-office workers redundant. In total, over 100,000 workers have been laid off in connection with AI in just the last 12 months. And Goldman Sachs just published research estimating that AI is displacing roughly 16,000 American jobs every single month. The hardest hit are entry-level workers. Young people in their 20s in AI-exposed occupations saw unemployment rise by 3%. Job-finding rates for workers aged 22 to 25 entering AI-exposed fields have dropped 14% since ChatGPT launched. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York reported that the underemployment rate for recent college graduates hit 42.5% at the end of 2025, the highest since 2020. And tech sector unemployment climbed to 5.8%, which is the highest since the dot-com bust in 2001. The median time for a laid-off tech worker to find a new job went from 3.2 months in 2024 to 4.7 months in early 2026, because the same positions are being eliminated across the entire industry simultaneously. And here is the part that should terrify every policymaker in this country. There is no federal legislation addressing AI-driven job displacement. None. No retraining mandate, no safety net expansion, no requirement for companies to provide severance or transition support when they replace humans with machines. The companies doing this are posting record profits and buying back their own stock with the savings. The gains from AI are going to shareholders and executives. The losses are going to workers. And Washington is silent. Can I be honest with you for a second? Because I think this needs to be said by somebody, and apparently nobody who has a microphone in Washington is willing to say it. An entire generation of Americans was raised on a promise that has been systematically broken. They were told to go to school, get an education, work hard, and the system would reward them with stability, home ownership, health care, and a future that was at least as good as their parents had. And every single piece of that promise has collapsed. Gen Z is entering the workforce, carrying an average of $94,000 in personal debt according to Newsweek. A third of them describe themselves as financially underwater. Only 26% own a home. The average Gen Z worker makes roughly $25,000 a year, which is barely enough to cover rent and food in most metropolitan areas. Nearly half run out of money before the month ends. And when they look up from their bank accounts and try to build a career, they are walking into a job market where AI is the #1 reason companies are cutting positions, where 42.5% of recent college graduates are underemployed, and where the industries they trained for are being restructured beneath their feet before they even get started. And it is not just Gen Z. Millennials are in their 30s and early 40s now. They are supposed to be in their wealth-building years, and 63% of them are living paycheck to paycheck. The ones who managed to buy homes during the pandemic needed $200,000 down payments in markets like New York, and still ended up in neighborhoods that were not their first or even second choice. One millennial on social media put it perfectly. He said, "We are the first generation that has to pay more for everything but downgrade our life in every single way. And that is why you are seeing the rise of credit card debt confessionals all over the internet. People sitting in their cars crying because they cannot figure out how to pay off the $13,000 they owe. Nurses saying they make good money but still have no money. Teachers driving Uber Eats after their shifts to feed their families. Couples working 10 combined jobs between them and still drowning." A woman named Chanda told the Wall Street Journal that she works 40 hours from home for a medical supply company making $45,000 and then works 20 to 25 hours at Pizza Hut for $12 an hour. All she said was 2 words, "I am tired." And that is the truest sentence in America right now, because the exhaustion you are seeing is not laziness. It is not poor financial planning. It is what happens when an entire system extracts more from people than it gives back, and then tells them the problem is their attitude. Student loans totaling $1.66 trillion, with a serious delinquency rate of 16.2%. Credit card debt at $1.28 trillion with an average APR of 22.8%. Car payments at $742 a month. Health insurance that just doubled. Rent that takes 30 to 50% of income. And wages that have not kept pace with any of it. The people who set up this system got theirs. Cheap homes, pensions, affordable education, functional health care. And then they dismantled every single one of those things on their way out the door. That is not an opinion. That is a timeline you can trace through policy decisions going back 4 decades. And the generation inheriting what is left has every right to be furious, because they did everything they were told, and it was not enough. It was never going to be enough, because the game was already rigged before they sat down at the table. Trust has collapsed and no one is coming to fix this. There is a number that I think captures the state of this country more accurately than any GDP figure or jobs report or stock market index, and that number is 17. 17%. That is the percentage of Americans who trust the federal government to do the right thing, according to the most recent Pew Research data. In 1964, that number was 77%. We have gone from more than 3 out of 4 Americans trusting the government to fewer than 1 out of 5 in the span of 60 years. And it is not just the government. The 2026 Edelman Trust Barometer, which is the most comprehensive global trust survey in the world, surveying nearly 34,000 people across 28 countries, found that only 21% of Americans believe the next generation will be better off. That is down 9 points from the year before. 1 in 5, 80% of Americans look at the country their children will inherit and see something worse than what they have. And the trust gap between high-income and low-income Americans has more than doubled since 2012, from 6 points to 15 points, with the widest gap in the entire survey being right here in the United States at 29 points. The rich trust the system because the system works for them. The poor do not trust the system because it has failed them at every turn. And the middle is caught between the two, watching both realities unfold simultaneously and becoming increasingly disoriented. Gallup found that newspapers, the criminal justice system, television news, big business, and Congress all have the confidence of fewer than 20% of Americans. Congress is at 7%, 7. And the Edelman data showed something that I think is even more troubling than the trust numbers themselves. 7 in 10 Americans report being unwilling or hesitant to trust someone with different values, different approaches to social issues, different backgrounds, or different information sources. They called it insularity, not polarization. Insularity. People are not just disagreeing anymore. They are withdrawing. They are retreating into smaller and smaller circles of trust. Their employer, their coworkers, their neighbors, their family, and they are writing off everything else. National government leaders saw a net trust loss of 16 points over the past 5 years. Major news organizations lost 11 points. And the forces driving this are exactly the things we have been talking about in this video. Economic anxiety, with 2/3 of employees worrying that trade policies will hurt their employer. The collapse of optimism about the future. Eroding institutional competence, and the information crisis, with 65% of people worried that foreign actors are injecting falsehoods into national media to inflame domestic divisions. And a professor at Tufts named Daniel Dresner said something that I think everyone watching this needs to hear. He said, despite the political polarization, both sides feel like they are losing. And populaces in countries that are pessimistic about the future often end up doing really bad things. That is not a political statement, that is a historical observation. And it should concern every single person watching this, regardless of who they voted for. The gap between the official narrative about the American economy and the lived reality of the American people has never been wider. They tell you GDP is growing, and it is. But the economy lost 92,000 jobs in February, and the labor market outside of healthcare has been shrinking for over a year. They tell you inflation is coming down, and the rate of increase has slowed, but prices are 24% above where they were in 2020, and they are not coming back down. $4 bread is not going back to $2.29. That is gone. They tell you the unemployment rate is historically low at 4.4%, but two-thirds of the country is living paycheck to paycheck. 27% have zero emergency savings, and the NFCC says a growing segment of Americans are technically insolvent. They tell you AI is going to create more jobs than it destroys. But in March 2026, it was the #1 reason companies gave for firing people, and there is not a single federal law protecting workers from it. They tell you housing is stabilizing, but the median first-time buyer is 40 years old and needs to earn $114,000 to afford a typical home, while the average salary is $64,000. They tell you the war in Iran will be short, but gas is at $4.08, diesel is at $5.40, fertilizer is up 41%, and the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. They tell you healthcare is a priority, but 22 million people just had their insurance subsidies ripped away, and 1 in 10 has already dropped coverage because they cannot afford the new premiums. And they tell you to trust the system, but only 17% of Americans do. And every single institution from Congress to the media to the criminal justice system is at historic lows. That gap, the distance between what they are saying and what you are living, that is not an accident, it is a feature. Because as long as the metrics look good on paper, the people in power can point to the numbers and say everything is fine. GDP is growing, the stock market is up, unemployment is low, and if you are struggling, well, that must be your problem. Your financial planning, your choices, your fault. And I am telling you right now, that is a lie. It is the biggest lie in America today. Because when $18.8 trillion in household debt, record credit card balances, doubled health insurance premiums, $742 car payments, a frozen housing market, an AI-driven mass layoff wave, a foreign war driving up the cost of everything, and a government that 83% of its own citizens do not trust, are all happening at the same time. That is not a collection of individual failures. That is a system that is failing the people it was designed to serve. And the only people who are going to be okay through what comes next are the ones who stopped waiting for someone to fix this and started making decisions based on reality instead of the story they are being told. Get out of high-interest debt. Build a skill that cannot be automated. Have a 3-month emergency fund, even if you have to start with $25 a week. Have honest conversations with your family about money. Stop pretending things are going to go back to normal. Normal is gone. What we are standing in right now is the new baseline. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start building something that actually works. If this video showed you something you did not see before, or if it put into words something you have been feeling but could not quite explain, do me a favor. Send it to one person who needs to hear it. Not for the algorithm. Because these conversations matter, and they are not happening enough in the places where they should be happening. At the dinner table, between friends, between parents and kids who are trying to figure out how to survive in this. And if you want to keep following this, because I promise you this story is not over, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I am going to keep breaking this down as it unfolds. No spin, no agenda, just the data and what it actually means for your life. Take care of yourselves out there. Take care of your families, and I will see you in the next one.